Welcome to the studio. Pull up a chair because we're going to be painting an abstract landscape. This is the second abstract landscape I've shared with you. If you missed the first one, I'll link it down below so you can paint along with me, as well as the resource guide for this one. It includes the sketch for the brushstrokes, as well as several of the attempts that I made while putting this tutorial together so that you can draw inspiration from to continue your explorations. Let's make some magic. Let's do a quick run through of our supplies. Water, of course. I've got 3 brushes. They're from Meeden. They're my go-to brushes. It's a size 8, 5, and a 1. Watercolors, I'm using Art Oil in my Meeden palette. I'll keep them mostly here. I will pull out 2 of the colors to mix because I'll be intensifying their darkness as we paint layers. So I'll be using Sap Green, Cerulean Blue, and then Azo Yellow Medium. Paper, I'm using this pad from Layton. It is 10.6 by 7.7. Some Posca markers for marks towards the end. And then a heat gun. I usually like to paint multiple things and let things dry naturally, but for the sake of time in this tutorial, I will be drying my layers. And then for finishing touches, acrylic gold ink and a dip pen. I'm using my paper in portrait or vertical orientation because I think it works best for this tall evergreen tree. And we're going to be doing the first layer wet on wet. I usually start applying the water in spirals to, and of course my brush is not that clean, in spirals to help my wrist warm up. And I'm going to leave a space here and come in and add a long, tall swoop because that's where our tree is going to be. And then our sky up here. We're going to come in first with the Sap Green. And we're going to place a good amount here in this little bowl because I'll be adding Payne's Gray as we get into further layers to add the branches of that tree. So you're going to just come down with a long swooping stroke, and you're going to want to make sure that your brush has a lot of water. That helps to have the brush glide on the piece of paper. After the initial stroke, I'm coming back in with loose, short strokes just to give a loose form to the tree. I'm not worrying about the details here, hence why I'm using a size 8 brush. So I'm just giving these small swoops so that I have a guide for when I come in with details in the second layers. And I'm going to come in with a paper towel to just dab a little bit here towards the top of the tree where it got a little dark. Okay, now we're going to clean our brush and grab some of that cerulean blue or whatever color you want to use for your sky. Okay, we've got a cerulean blue, and then for the sky, you're going to start around here with your brush stroke, and then with the belly of the brush as much on the paper as possible, sweep down here and try to get in 3 swoops. Like this, so 1, 2, 3, leaving open space. We're going to come back in and add the sun. Since I'm right-handed, every one of my attempts has had the tree on the right side, but I encourage you to explore and see what it feels like to place the tree on the left side. Now I'm removing some of that pigment and now blending into the rest of our paper. I want this layer to be very light because it's not about the details, it's just about getting a foundation for what's to come in the following layers. Your brush strokes don't have to be exactly like mine. Have fun exploring and see the shapes that bring you joy. And I'm just going to pull back some of this pigment here so that our sun has a little bit more space. And pull back a little bit of the branches even more. Now I'm coming in with Azo Yellow Medium, and I'm going to add 3 spirals here, a small one, a medium one, and a larger one. I'm going to come back in with a little bit of water just to blend them so we get that soft base layer. And now we're going to dry this. Now that that's dry, we're going to come back in with the smaller brush. I'm using the 5 for this, and add yellow spirals here to define our sun. A few more brush strokes here on top of the tree to define our branches, and then some swirls to define our sky. And we're going to be mixing Payne's Gray to the Cerulean Blue and the Sap Green, just a little bit to intensify their darkness. But first, we're going to come in with the yellow to define our sun. And I'm just coming in and I'm going to add definition to the larger strokes that are already on the paper, as well as adding a few embellishments in the lighter area. Hold your brush loosely here, just enough to guide it. For the larger strokes, use just enough pressure to let the belly of the brush meet the paper, then gently trail off as you finish the stroke. The less you control the brush, the looser and more expressive your marks will become. When adding the lighter details, I sometimes barely skim the surface, letting the brush skip and glide across the paper. Those imperfect broken marks are part of what gives the landscape its movement and character. And I'm just going to grab the tiniest bit of Payne's Gray. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to add some brush strokes to define the outer edge, and then a few in this lighter space, leaving some space for some darker strokes in the next layer. One of the things that I love most about watercolor is that even though we begin with the same colors and the same formula for the first layer, everything we add afterwards makes our painting uniquely ours. Use this as an opportunity to notice what feels natural in your hand. Which movements do you enjoy making? Which shapes spark your curiosity? Which marks make you want to try them again? Those are the little clues worth following. Take a look at the resource guide and you'll see exactly what I mean. The same foundation can lead somewhere completely different each time. Now we're going to move on to the Sap Green, and again, same thing, just add a small amount of Payne's Gray to the Sap Green. And for this, we're going to add some brush strokes vertically coming in as a V, and then here we're going to transition to upside down versions of the strokes we're doing up here, so that we end up with this texture for the tree. Feel free to reference the resource guide for a closer look at the tree brush strokes on their own. I've included a study of the tree so you can see how the downward strokes at the top gradually transition into the upward sweeping marks that create the fullness through the body of the tree. Use it as a guide as you practice. And we're being careful to leave some open space so that we can still see the lighter background. And we're also going to be coming in with an even darker mix. And then we're going to add a little bit more definition here to our field. And again, these brush strokes are easier when your brush has more water. Before we dry this, I'm going to come back in with a smaller brush to add a few more blue strokes, more to these outside edges. You can see here that my brush didn't have quite enough water to glide across the page. It did create a beautiful texture, but it wasn't the sweeping stroke I was looking for. So I simply picked up a little more water and pigment and tried again. As you paint, your eye will begin to recognize where the smaller marks can add rhythm, where you want to create movement, and which areas you want to accentuate. That intuition comes with practice. The more you explore, the more you'll learn. All right, let's dry this and we'll come back in with another layer of detail. Now we're going to mix a darker mix of Cerulean and Payne's Gray, as well as Sap Green and Payne's Gray. And now I'm going to stick with the smaller brush to add these smaller details. And we're going to start with the Cerulean Blue, mix with Payne's Gray. One of the reasons I love these mop brushes is their versatility. With more pressure, I can let the full belly of the brush meet the paper for a broad sweeping stroke, then gradually trail off with the tiniest mark using the tapered point. This is true for the 1 and the 8. You'll notice some of my brush strokes become very small and delicate. Here, I'm barely guiding the brush, lightly skimming the paper, almost letting it skip across the surface as the stroke trails away. I love how these marks begin to look like little ribbons twisting through the landscape. They don't just add detail, they also create movement and give your eyes somewhere to wander. As you practice, notice how your light and dark marks work together. More dark strokes will deepen an area, while lighter, delicate marks can create movement and guide the eye through your painting. For me, that's what these landscapes are really about, creating movement and little moments of joy for the eye to follow. I also love tucking little joyful marks into my painting. For me, that's often a tiny heart nestled into a pocket where 2 brush strokes meet. Sometimes it's unmistakably a heart, other times it's just a loose suggestion of one. We're returning to the tree with our darker mix of Payne's Gray and Sap Green, following the same pattern from the previous layer. We begin at the top with vertical downward strokes, then gradually transition into upward sweeping marks as you move through the body of the tree. Remember to leave little pockets of open space between your strokes so those beautiful first layers can still peek through. We're adding depth, not covering up what we've already created. We're also going to add a few darker strokes throughout the field, using them intentionally to guide your eye back towards the base of the tree and into that upward sweeping movement. You don't need many, just a few well-paced marks can create contrast and help carry the eye towards the landscape. Before we dry this layer, we're going to add a few more details to the sun. We're going to use a richer concentration of pigment around the edges to add definition, then use those light tapered brush strokes to gently fill in some of those open areas. Keep it loose and let a little space remain. We're adding depth and movement without losing a lot of the lightness underneath. If you painted with me before, you probably knew that this layer was inevitable. It is my favorite. It's adding shimmer watercolor details throughout the landscape. I like to choose shimmer colors that complement the colors already on my page. So here I'm reaching for shades that match our Azo Yellow Medium, Sap Green, and Cerulean Blue. And I hope that you don't skip this layer. While you're painting, some of these marks may seem almost invisible, but once everything dries and the light catches them, the landscape comes to life with these tiny magical glimmers. Keep it light. Follow what delights you. This layer is all about adding a little more joy. I usually work with either a size 5 or a size 1 brush here, depending on the marks that I want to create. Keep your hands loose and work quickly. We're not trying to cover everything in shimmer, we're simply adding little hints of light as if we're catching pieces of that glorious sunlight throughout the landscape. If you need to go slowly, go slowly. Pause and go at your own pace. With practice, your hand will begin to recognize these movements and your marks will become more quicker and more intuitive. I've been painting this way for a while, so I often work quickly without consciously thinking about every brushstroke. But you don't need to start there. Go slow. When I add details, I'm responding to what's already on the page. I trace the movements of existing marks and I add shimmer to any pocket that feels a little light, or use a finer stroke to bring out something I want to see more of. We're not creating something entirely new, we're adding a little more magic to what's already there. Keep plenty of water on your brush and revisit the resource guide whenever you need a closer look at the brush strokes. I also want to share a tip from Rose from the Wild Joy Society. Thank you, Rose. If it helps, print out the resource guide and use a light table to trace the brush strokes and practice the movements. Tracing these sweeping, swirly strokes can help your hand become more comfortable with the motion. This isn't about getting it right, it's simply about practicing until the movement begins to feel natural. So eventually you can stop thinking about the brushstroke and start following your curiosity. It's time for the acrylic gold ink. I like to use a dip pen because I love those loose organic marks that it allows me to create. I add the gold very minimally, placing it only in areas where I want to create a little more focus or rhythm. Think of these marks as tiny points of interest, little moments that catch the light and help guide your eye throughout the landscape. You don't need much, just a few intentional marks are enough. And I use a similar technique with my dip pen as I do with my sweeping brush strokes. I hold the pen almost parallel to the paper so I can use the widest part of the nib, then slowly sweep it across the page, following the movement we created in the previous layers. As I move through the stroke, I gradually lift and taper off, allowing the mark to become finer toward the end. This is one of my favorite ways to add gold because the marks echo the movement that's already happening in the landscape rather than competing with it. I'm pretty generous with the amount of ink that I load onto my pen because I love the texture that it leaves behind. You can see it especially against the blue. There's these little bubbles and raised areas that begin to form as the ink settles onto the paper. I love leaving those imperfections because they add another layer of texture and dimension to the landscape. Let the ink do its thing. Sometimes those unexpected little details are the most interesting ones. Adding a second heart in gold ink was inevitable for me. I'm also going to be adding a few dots to some of the open spaces. For these, I do hold my pen almost vertically, so I'm working with just the tip of the nib, which gives me a little more control over the amount of ink I can place on the paper. But if an extra generous dot happens to land, I let it be. I love the variation in size. It adds visual interest, character, and another little moment for the eye to discover. Even though I tend to work loosely and quickly, I want to encourage you to pause and scan your painting as you go. Look for areas that feel like they could use one more detail, a little more movement, or a small moment of joy. There is no right way to do this. The more you paint, the more you'll begin to notice the patterns, marks, and details you naturally return to again and again. I work quickly because it helps keep my brush strokes loose, but that doesn't mean you need to rush. Take as much time as you need, let your eye wander, trust what catches your attention, and add only what feels right to you. As you scan your painting, you may notice that an area needs something from an earlier layer, and that's okay. These layers aren't rules you have to follow in order. Here, I decided to return to shimmer watercolor because the tree felt like it needed a little more contrast, and so I mixed a darker shade to add. Let the painting tell you what it needs. Go back, add another mark, revisit a color, or bring in a little more shimmer. The process can be just as fluid as the watercolor itself. One little note before you go back is to make sure that the area is dry. If the watercolor is still wet, then your new marks may bleed or mix with the colors underneath in ways you weren't expecting. Unless, of course, that's the effect you're curious to explore. Let these final layers be an invitation to explore the supplies you already have and see what else might belong in your landscape. Here I'm adding a few marks with Posca markers to bring in more definition and fill in some of the little pockets that feel like they need another detail. You can experiment with contrasting colors, introduce a new material, or like I'm doing here, choose colors that bring out what's already on the page. Follow what catches your eye. These final marks are a chance to play, experiment, and make the landscape feel unmistakably yours. The more you explore, the more you'll discover what you enjoy and what you don't. That's part of the process. We have to try things before we know what feels like ours. For me, one of those things is adding dots. I love creating them in little clusters, often in groups of 3. There's something incredibly peaceful about letting my mind settle into the simple rhythm of dot after dot. I return to them because I genuinely enjoy making them. As you explore, pay attention to your own little discoveries. What makes you want to make again? What movements feel good in your hand? What part of the process makes you lose track of everything else for a moment? Make a note of those things. Write them on the back of your painting or keep them in a journal. Life gets busy and sometimes we forget what brings us joy. These little notes can become clues when you return to whenever you need inspiration or you have felt disconnected to find a way back. Joy leaves clues, so pay attention to yours. This time absolutely flew by for me, and I hope it did for you too. I hope somewhere between the sweeping brushstrokes, little dots, shimmer, and tiny details, you found yourself getting lost in the joy of making. I hope you love what you created, but even more, I hope you discovered something you want to try again. Keep following those little sparks of curiosity. And here's the closer look at the finished landscape and all the details we added along the way. Be sure to look at the resource guide for even more inspiration. Thank you so much for painting with me. I hope you're walking away with this with lots of inspiration and ready to create all sorts of magic. If you painted along with me, I want to see it because that brings me so much joy. If you watch this on YouTube, please share that in the community tab. And if you're watching on Facebook, please share it in the comments or send me a direct message. Thank you again for joining me in the studio. I look forward to our next session. Until next time, stay wild.